Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conservation Biology, Biology 340. This lecture is on conservation and overexploitation. I'm Dr. Jeff Stratford from Wilkes University. So the theoretical hook we're going to hang our hat on is all about population. So let's go back and review some basic population biology. First, when you're dealing with a population that has a carrying capacity, which is any population, and we look at population growth, there's a sigmoidal curve. So it starts out slow, it speeds up, and then levels off again. Where it levels off is at K, the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is the level of the population at which the environment can hold. So if you can fit 10 goldfish in your tank, your carrying capacity is 10. If we examine the slopes of this line here, this population growth line, and convert that to dNdt, which is the growth rate, and compare that to n, okay? So it's just looking at how the slopes change over this curve. You get a graph like this, where at low end, population growth rate is slow. So as we look at the steps here, it's relatively slow. And near carrying capacity, it's also slow. So it can actually be 0. As you get close to 1/2 carrying capacity, you speed up, you hit 1/2 carrying capacity, and then you start to slow down. So that's an inflection point. Okay. What 1/2 carrying capacity is called among land users and managers is maximum sustainable yield. And what that is, this is the level of the population which can be removed, which will result in the fastest repopulation. Okay, whether that be trees, trout, or mallards. If you harvest beyond the maximum sustainable yield for that scenario, so if you're harvesting trees every 25 years, and that is half the carrying capacity. If you start to harvest more than that, you will not get the regrowth you need to have that as a sustainable management strategy. You can adjust your strategy and you might be successful. If you harvest less, you're just not maximizing the number of organisms you can take from the environment. So 1/2 carrying capacity is the maximum sustainable yield. So remember, that's the most you want to remove to have sustainable populations. To know what 1/2 K is, you have to know what K is. And your carrying capacity is hardly ever actually known. It can be estimated, but it's hardly ever known. It's very unlikely that it's constant. So remember that carrying capacity is what the environment can hold. So if you are an organism that eats insects, then the population of insects is very rarely going to be constant. So that will alter carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is unlikely to be a constant. And then harvest. So if you are, say, managing deer, it's very unlikely you're going to get the same number of deer killed every season, deer season. So theoretically, this is very nice, but I just wanted to point out the difficulties with managing an actual population. So what we consider to be overhunting is when we exceed the maximum sustainable yield and we are no longer taking animals or plants or anything out of the population in a sustainable way. Why does it happen? Their animals are overhunted for food, for clothing, for culture, medicine, and to protect livestock. When you take animals outside of regulation, that is considered poaching. And those animals are typically considered to be bushmeat. Okay. Not only is the harvesting of bushmeat and poaching bad for conservation, I should point out that bushmeat is also the source of many zoonotic diseases, including HIV, monkeypox, and Ebola. If you are taking animals out of a population and bringing them to market alive, that's called a wet market. And not only are wet markets bad for conservation, they're the source of several zoonotic diseases. And the latest one is SARS-CoV-2. In fact, there's several SARS viruses that have come out of wet markets. So let's go over cultural reasons why animals might be harvested. And there's just hundreds of reasons, but I'll just go over a few. So um, in Mexico, there are some traditional charms that are made out of hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are taken out of the population. Um, Elephant and walrus ivory. You can carve it. It's called scrimshaw and can become artwork. You have many endangered caimans and crocodiles, and those are made into shoes and wallets. And then you have more mundane uses of wildlife. What's shown here is a confiscated tiger that's just used as a throw rug. Um, I've seen elephant legs made into umbrella holders, and it's really unfortunate and terrible. Animals can be overhunted for medicine. So there are several Chinese medicines, traditional Chinese medicines, sorry, that use animal parts. And some examples here are rhino horns are used as an aphrodisiac. You have black bear gallbladders, where only the gallbladders removed. For rhinos, the animal shot and only the horns are removed. And then tiger bones. So I just put out there some of the many reasons that animals are hunted unsustainably. Where does sustainable hunting fit in? Well, in the US, the Lacey Act of 1900 forbade the use of animals commercially. So you couldn't shoot a deer and then sell it. Um, and then later in 1918, as a response to the near extinction of egrets, which were shot for their reproductive plumage, that they only have a few weeks out of the year, and they were turned into hats. So, in response to that, you had the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which is still in effect, and the Lacey Act is still into effect. And just to describe the photos, the one on the left is a woman's hat with egret wings, and then on the right was the wholesale slaughter of hawks at Hawk Mountain. And both of these actions became illegal with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that scene on the right is was taken from Hawk Mountain. Sustainable hunting is now a personal thing, which means you can hunt for personal reasons, and it's become a large source of income. And so this is a friend of mine in Africa, and the meat goes to the local population, so they no longer have to uh, unsustainably hunt bushmeat. It's more regulated, so we have an idea of how many animals are taking and where. And there's an incentive to protect game populations. So um, The animals that might be hunted are protected on game that might be hunted for bushmeat are protected on game areas. So by protecting the kudu for tourist hunting, you're also protecting many of the other species that are found in that land, and provides income for locals that serve as guides. Okay, from hunting to overfishing, and I'm going to break overfishing into marine and freshwater overfishing. So if you can imagine, if you are in a marine environment, the difference between managing, say, a deer population, and even deer, it's hard to find every deer, but imagine trying to manage fish in the ocean where fish never come above the surface, so they're nearly impossible to count. Fish populations are also called fish stocks in the trade. So what we'll use are indices, and indices just means we know if the population is going up or down, but we never have an absolute number unless you're talking about some things like whales. And even whales, we found that we've both overcounted and undercounted whales just because they're difficult to count. Um, Thing with large bodies, marine organisms, that those are the most vulnerable. So whales, things like right whales, almost hunted to extinction. Some large tuna have become endangered, and other pelagic species that are large bodied, like marlins and swordfish. Pelagic just means they live in the open ocean. Bycatch is an issue, uh, in particular sea turtles. So when you're using a seine for shrimp, you'll also catch turtles, and that can become an issue. And many coral reef species are over harvested because you're talking about shallower water and a confined area, and the fish are much easier to find. And as well in around coral reefs is you have the pet trade for things like seahorses and fish and some shells, some mollusks. One type of fishing that is particularly disruptive are called bottom trawls. These are the way that scallops are harvested. And a bottom trawl is essentially just taking a fishing net with a frame and then dragging the bottom of the fishing net along the bottom of the ocean. And then organisms like scallops that live at the bottom will just be pulled into the fishing net. Some solutions to marine overfishing. There's many international agreements, and there's much better technologies to find fish and then avoid fish you don't want to catch. And then there's some technologies to reduce the bycatch. So turtle exclusion devices. These are just small windows on the sides of nets that turtles can go off to the side and get out, um, with some success. And the biggest one are marine reserves where they don't have commercial fishing. There could be private fishing. And so what you have is the creation of source populations. And a source population is where I have here that alpha is greater than, and I should put one. It just means that births are exceeding deaths and the population is growing. And these are just two pictures from the Hull Chan Marine Reserve in Belize. It's a coral reef and just amazing. Overfishing is not just a problem in marine ecosystems, it's also a problem in freshwater ecosystems. And just to give you these are just a few examples, not the only ones. You have caviar, which is eggs, and that has led to the depletion of sturgeon in Russia and some of the surrounding countries. Trout in the US are not taken sustainably, and other large fishes and turtles globally are endangered. And here are just some examples. That gentleman is holding an extremely large tambaqui, which is a fruit-eating fish. So these fish invade the flooded forests in the Amazon and eat fruits that fall into the water. It's amazing fish and is actually quite delicious. Arapaima in South America. Um, I've seen some of these that exceed 2 meters. And what's happening in both these species is they're still out there, but the size has gone down. So there's very few old fish out there. Giant catfish in the Mekong is nearly extinct. And then the paddlefish in the US is in decline. And that is my favorite fish. And I suggest you look up the paddlefish because it is a exceedingly interesting fish to look at. Okay, so solutions to freshwater overfishing. Bag limits, obviously, that you can only take so many fish of a certain size. So bag limits are extremely important. In some places, especially for trout, you have barbless catch and release and a barbless hook. So you have a hook and a barb is a small um, piece that sticks out by the hook that doesn't let the hook pull out straight. And it's a barb that you would pull when you pull out a barbed hook, it tears the mouth of the fish. And if you are a predatory fish that relies on closing its mouth tight, um, the injuries from barbs can essentially just let you starve to death. So barbless catch and release is important for trout. And then we have fish farming for things like tilapia and catfish. And I would like to point out that this is one of the solutions that you find in saltwater as well. Salmon farming is a big thing. And I just want to point out that fish farming comes with its own problems because you have a large number of fish packed tightly together. And anytime you have very dense populations of organisms, you're going to have disease and pollution problems. One solution to freshwater overfishing you're probably familiar with is stocking. Problem with stocking, it's often the non-native fish. I know that native brook trout are stocked in many places, but we also have brown trout and rainbow trout stocked in Pennsylvania waters, in fact, all over the East Coast. Brown trout are not even native to North America. They come from Europe. And these can actually alter stream communities because they're very voracious hunters. Rainbow trout come from out west. And when you ask fisheries people, why are you stocking non-native species? It's because they are paid by the license holders, and the license holders determine uh, how their fishery gets managed. So if you buy a fishing license and you don't like this, you can always contact your fisheries people and tell them, as a fisherman, as someone that buys a license, this is how you would like streams to be managed. You also have things like stream restoration, um, and that's where you plant trees on the sides of streams. That does two things. It prevents erosion and flash, but also cools the streams, which is really important for things like trout. Most state agencies do not do stream restoration, they do fish stocking. And then non-governmental organizations like Trout Unlimited will do the stream restoration. One interesting aspect of fish conservation is marketing. So generally the strategies for conservation and overexploitation is education, regulation, and substitution. So substitution is when you take one animal instead of another. And so what you'll find is instead of taking cod, you'll take another species. So cod were in steep decline. Sometimes what they've done when I say marketing is they changed the name to make a less appetizing fish more appetizing and increase the market, which can take the pressure off the original species that was harvested. And just to give an example, there was a fish called slimehead, and they changed the name to orange ruffy. Orange ruffy sounds delicious, where slimehead does not. It's the same fish. It's just how it is marketed. And actually, this marketing campaign was too successful, and now the orange ruffy is a little bit in trouble. Um, Speaking of substitution, this is a lionfish. It's an invasive species um, on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast of South America. This one's in a tank, but I have seen this species in Belize and Puerto Rico. And this is a fish, even in the marine fishing reserves, you can take this species. This is a species that will get into coral reefs and will eat all the juvenile fish. So it's not a good fish to have around. If you're interested in these topics on what marine fish you should eat and from where and how it's raised, you can always go to seafoodwatch.org and get more information. For plants, make sure I have enough time here. Got enough time. For plants, overharvesting is an issue for plants as well. For plants such as orchids, and there's a few other species, the bromeliads, they can be collected to the point of endangerment of it or extinction. And just pictured here is a picture I took at an undisclosed location, and that's a pink lady slipper. So you can see why some collectors think that orchids are just cool because they are. In the US, there's my, I don't know if you want to call it nemesis species or my unicorn. I've been searching for this plant for years and I've yet to see it. The climbing fern, Lygodium palmatum, it was harvested in large numbers. It's a climbing fern. It's a vine essentially. And what you would do is it would stay green all winter, even when it was dead. And so what people would do is they'd put it on their front porches, up the pillars and the spires, and have it go around their fireplaces. It's green and cheery, I guess. Uh, Over harvesting for food and plants is not so much a problem where it is in animals, although foraging is now a thing. People are going out and just finding wild foods, something I appreciate, but something we should keep an eye on as being problematic in the future. And then um, two last things is that traditional Chinese medicine again has been a major threat to a number of plant species, and I think one of the more popular plants that is disappeared across our landscape is American ginseng, is just largely gone. And that's just not traditional Chinese medicine. That's also, just American sort of folk use has been a threat to this species. But there are other plants around the world that are over harvested for these medicines. Um, and lastly, timber poaching, which you don't think that plants can be poached, but some high value trees that have remarkable wood or some sort of interesting property can be poached. So you can have forest reserves for that plant, and people go in and cut it down. And mahogany's sweet tinea is one of those species that regularly gets poached because mahogany wood is so valuable. And our last topic is the pet trade. It's an what I would consider an underappreciated conservation issue. And what I mean by that is um, it affects thousands and thousands of individuals and hundreds of species. And most people don't even think about it. And sort of the catch 22 for conservation is that rare species are often the species that are most hunted, and it's because they are rare. So I'll give you an example. In Pennsylvania, the bog turtle is in trouble because one has lost a habitat, and the second one is because they're a cute, tiny little turtle, and people want them alive in their collections, so they get collected for the pet trade illegally. Um, Other types of animals that get collected in the pet trade are parrots. Okay, there was just a story yesterday about parrots being collected in Brazil. Turtles are very popular, and as well as snakes. That these species are collected from the wild in numbers that are not sustainable and these have some conservation issues. And some of these species, they're collected as pets and then become invasive species in other places. So pictured here is my friend Christina, and she is studying pythons and helping to remove pythons in the Everglades. So that is not a species that is native to North America, but yet they are right now thriving in the Everglades and are eating and a threat to many native species.